And you mentioned that the overthrow of a democratic country in Iran, and that obviously had some negative consequences that we're actually still dealing with. Another one in Guatemala you talk about quite a bit. And one of the things you said in your book is that the number of murders in Guatemala actually rivals the number of murders happening in Iraq. So that kind of permanent unrest in these countries where the purpose of the CIA's action was to protect our national security and to create stability, yet that doesn't seem to be the result.
Well, one thing that to me isn't properly understood when you look at the immigration crisis in this country, you have to ask yourself how many people decided to leave Central America because of violence that the CIA was partially or fully responsible for. So when you think of the key countries that are feeding immigrants into the United States, such as El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, Nicaragua, these are the countries where the CIA mounted major programs that involved tremendous acts of violence and assassination policy, and working with some of the worst security units of these governments and these military regimes. And that has, to me, a direct result in leading to immigration to the United States.
And yet, you write that the CIA would consider those operations successes from their paramilitary point of view.
From a paramilitary point of view, the CIA has taken a lot of pride in those operations, just as they do in the Afghan operation in the 1980s, which helped to create terrorist groups such as Hekmat Yarah's group, the Haqqani group, Al-Qaeda itself. Were formerly fighters with Mujahideen, and now they're the toughest enemies that the United States confronts in Afghanistan.
And recently we've had a coup in Egypt and President of the Ukraine overthrown. I don't have any information that the CIA was involved in those, but does that history of activity color the foreign policy options that we have there?
Well, I believe that it does, because something I do know a good deal about was the early 1980s, and that was the revolutionary ferment in Poland. That was the labor union responding to a communist government, Solidarność. And the CIA was involved in Poland. They were running covert operations in support of Solidarity and in support of Lech Walesa. And of course the Soviets knew that. So when you have a current Russian leader, particularly one such as Putin, who spent most of his professional career in the KGB, he has a right to assume that the CIA was involved in the Ukraine. And I have to believe that there were probably programs dedicated to support the ferment, the opposition to the government. So our hands are not clean by any means in this operation. Putin is convinced that the United States is trying to weaken him and trying to manipulate the very sphere of influence that Putin is very sensitive about. So I think we played a role in this crisis in Ukraine and Crimea. You can't separate the fact that the United States told the Soviet Union that if they got out of East Germany, we would not leapfrog over East Germany to go into Eastern Europe. And then 5 years later, we began to expand NATO, first under Bill Clinton with former members of the Warsaw Pact, and then under George Bush with former republics of the Soviet Union. That is what leapfrogging means, particularly to someone such as Vladimir Putin.